I said I was going to go fast through these and I've been lying so far, so let's see if I can speed up just a little. But I want to talk a little bit about research methods. Um, it can be easy to just say interviews and observation. And indeed, that's pretty much always, we include those two almost always. But really, you should try to, in theory, fit what research methods you use to what data you want. Now, by virtue of being an anthropologist or an ethnographer, they're probably not going to call you in and be like, hey, can you figure out how to solve cold fusion for us? They're going to probably be asking you questions that are more or less tailored to what an ethnographer would do. Like, can you figure out like if people actually engage with our science and if they actually like being at our historic site? Um, but in theory, you want to figure out what your questions are first. And then once you figured out your questions, that can give you the methods. You don't want to go the other way around. You don't want to be like, I'm going to go interview people about something and then tailor your questions to the method. You want to start with the questions and then figure out, given that, what kinds of methods would give me the info that I want or need. Um, as part of that, you're going to want to figure out what data you need. I know that feels unnatural for a lot of social scientists. If you want to say instead knowledge that I want to learn from the community, that's great. But however you want to phrase it, you need to figure out what pieces of information you're going to need to tell the story that they want you to tell. And as part of that, you're going to need to probably operationalize your variable. Don't freak out on me here. Let me explain what I mean by that. If you're not familiar with that terminology, it just means basically define your terms, right? So if I say, I want to understand what motivates people to visit your historic site in your town, that's great. That's a great thing to say. It's better if you can clarify what you mean by motivate and how you're going to measure that. Well, I'm going to measure it by talking to people. Great. Or I'm going to measure it by looking at what they post on social media and how they express why they traveled here. Great. The more specific you can get, the better, so you know what you're trying to find. Because going to a field site is like diving into an ocean. There's a lot of stuff going on. Good if you can focus on what fish you're trying to find. Yes, by the way, so in general, though, you fit your methods to your question, right? Whether that's I'm going to do interviews and observation, those are pretty much a given, but also maybe I'm going to do mapping, GIS, whatever, surveys, whatever it is. Sometimes a survey makes a lot of sense. Sometimes a survey makes 0 sense and is an expensive waste of time and money. So you got to figure out based on your questions what the methods are going to be. Sometimes, by the way, that's in theory. In actual practice, sometimes your employer doesn't want you to use a method and you have to just not do it because there's not enough time or money. You're like, oh, this would be awesome if we could do 200 interviews, and we do not have the time for that. Sometimes you are forced to do a method, whether or not it makes sense to you as a researcher, just because your employer wants it. And I've seen that a lot with students I've mentored that have worked for land agencies and stuff. Sometimes people just want surveys because it gives you a number, and then they have a number to be like, well, 80% of people supported X, Y, and Z on this piece of land. And then it's like, well, but there's only like 10 people that support that land. So how is the survey any better than an interview when you're working with such small numbers of stakeholders? Sometimes people just want the fancy numbers. So anyways, point is sometimes you have to go with what your employer wants, but to the degree that you have freedom, try to pick methods that fit the question. Get as specific as possible. You're going to do participant observation? Great. That's what we all do. Try to figure out as much as possible where you're going to do that, when you're going to do that, for how long you're going to do that, and what you're going to look at. Because what can happen otherwise is you just sort of wander aimlessly around some town, not knowing what you're looking at, which sometimes leads to great interactions and sometimes leads to really boring days where you didn't find anything useful. With interviews, you're going to do interviews? Great. That's what we all do. Make sure to figure out who you want to interview, who has information that you would like to learn from, and what are you trying to learn from that person. Depending on the site, that may need to be defined really broadly or narrowly, especially sometimes in communities with cultural norms that encourage people to be respectful of elders, for example. It's helpful to not be so specific that people feel like you're forcing them to answer specific kinds of questions, and instead to just more generally have it in your brain like, well, when I speak to an elder, I want to generally know what their experience has been like with this archaeological site, right? But at least a general map of what you're going to be asking about. Sometimes you make really specific, interview guides and stuff. That's something you can probably get more information on in a research methods class. And yet, of course, once you're in the field, you're going to be a little bit like Toucan Sam here, following your nose, right? Sometimes you have your idea of what you're going to do, and then you get in the field and you find something else super fascinating that's going to be way more relevant, and you got to adapt. In Lucans's case, she wanted to understand the impacts and the experiences of people that were coming there, but also the impacts they were having, especially on off-trail use, because it was a wilderness area, really strongly protected area, but people were doing some things that weren't like ideal. And so she did observations, she did interviews, she also did surveys, and the survey, I wasn't sure how that would end up, but it ended up being super useful. And one of the things she found, if you look at her data in those first chapters, is that for a large chunk of the people visiting that hiking area were young people and from local areas, which I was not expecting. I expected people from far away. So that gives you a very different picture of what we mean by tourists. So sometimes surveys can be super useful. But the point is, she used surveys because it fit the question of trying to figure out who the users were and what they were doing. She didn't use surveys just for funsies. So use the methods that fit what you're doing. Then you want to establish a timeline and a budget. I put here determine how much time it will take and then double that. This is, by the way, a diagram that Lukens has in her thesis. But, I say just kidding, but seriously, a lot of times research will take longer than you think. IRB, which is basically a clearance that you go through if you work for a university, might take a really long time. Bureaucratic approval through a national park might take a really long time, but also just sometimes the research itself takes a long time for all sorts of different reasons. And so definitely make a timeline, get a sense of when you're going to be doing what, so that you're not like just waiting around forever and never ending your project, because I've definitely seen people do that and they just keep doing more observation because they never know when to stop. Have an endpoint, although be a little flexible with it. Building rapport, getting to know community, getting to find people that want to be interviewed, which is kind of a big ask. That's kind of stuff that's kind of a little unpredictable, and you don't want to like force and rush people into it. So give it time, build a timeline. Having a timeline is very helpful, especially in working with employers and grant agencies and things like that. Also think realistically through reciprocity. Are you going to compensate people for the fact that they're giving you their time to interview? And if not, and it's not always appropriate to be like, thank you for the interview, here's some money. Are there other ways that you can be a good member of the community and show people that you appreciate and care about them and the knowledge they shared? Are there ways you could give to that community and just spend time there and be a real human being? Think through the budget realistically. Don't undersell what you'll need. It's easy to be like, oh, all I need is a smartphone with a recording app on it. There's going to be stuff that's going to be more expensive. You need even just things like gas money to get around to your different interviews. So don't undersell what you'll need. Ethnographic projects in some ways are really, really cheap compared to other forms of science. So don't be afraid to ask what to you might seem like a lot of money, but to the people you're working for might not seem like very much at all. Next, I talk about entering the field like a not idiot. And so, I've got Dwight Schrute here. Before I do anything, I ask myself, would an idiot do that? And if the answer is yes, I do not do that thing. So there's a lot of different things you do to make sure that you can, I don't want to say hit the ground running, because I don't think you ever do on an ethnographic project. I think sometimes we hit the ground like a crash landing and then pick up the pieces and start doing good work after we've picked it up. But there's things you can do to make the transition an easier one, and to make sure that you can do good work. One is ahead of time, figure out as much as you can about the site from Google, from people that have been there. Figure out when you want to go there, where you'll stay. Try to figure out if there's people you should touch base with that would be relevant to your interests. And then put here, establish rapport by being a decent human being. Just get involved in the community that you're in. If you're doing work with a commune, go to the commune meetings and like pick some freaking vegetables, right? Like do the things that a community member would do to be a decent human being. Figure out where people talk and when they talk. Do they talk at bars? Do they talk at an ice cream shop after they're done seeing a site for the day? Where is it that people congregate? And where would it be a place where people would want to talk to you and want to share knowledge with you? And when possible, work through connections. Find people that know other people, rather than just trying to randomly approach people and be like, hey, I got a recorder, want to be interviewed? So that's a little bit about entering the field and starting your project. I've got Ian Malcolm here to remember when he's like a freaking weirdo telling Dr. Sattler in the first Jurassic Park about chaos theory by putting a drop of water on a hand. It's a weird freaking scene. We tolerate it because it's Jeff Goldblum, but it's a weird scene, and you know it and I know it. But I've got it here to remind us to anticipate chaos, that oftentimes research will be a little unpredictable. That doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. I had many moments of crippling anxiety the first time I did a research project. Since then, research projects have been a lot less scary as you realize that there's a certain amount of unpredictability. There's also a certain amount of boom and bust. There's going to be times where you have a lot of information happening because there's great events going on that are relevant to your tourist project. And maybe you've got a bunch of tourists coming in all at one time. And then you've got a month where there's like nobody and it's just kind of dead in the town where you're doing a project. And that's okay too. It helps to have multiple pots in the fire. And maybe when there's a lull period in that community, maybe that's when you shift over to more like online work or literature review or something else to get to know this community better. And then I want to talk a little bit about some additional considerations to think about when you're doing a fieldwork project, whether about tourism or anything else. The first one is reflexivity. Basically, if you're not familiar with that term, it means acknowledging the limits and the strengths of the research you did. Since the 80s, anthropology has been big on, let's be real with what we found and didn't found, as opposed to stuff written before the 80s. You'll notice that most of the stuff written before the 80s, it sounds like you're reading a science textbook. The tourists of Western New York have XYZ practice and are typically XYZ in their ideology and blah, 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 blah. As if we can put people in a test tube. Reflexivity says, let's acknowledge limits and strengths of the research. That's not always possible, but try. Because we're not a microscope, right? We should take stock of the way we affected the research as well, and the fact that no person approaches their research perfectly or with no sorts of backgrounds that affect things. So figure out what you did find, what you didn't find, what the strengths of the research were, and what you can or can't speak to. Of course, don't do that into oblivion. Too many people have stopped doing good research because they question themselves too much, and that can feed into a lot of other things like social anxiety or imposter syndrome. Don't go that direction. And I get that direction probably better than most, believe me. But having at least a little bit of knowledge of kind of like what you can say and what you can't say about your research is helpful and good, especially when reporting back. Big Brother story. Oh, I can tell you that one another time. Well, no, I'll tell you it now. No, I'll tell you it another time. The second thing is positionality. Knowing your own background in relation to the subject is always really helpful and something that's good to spell out before you start the project and as you're going along, because you, in a sense, are the microscope. Even though I just said you're not the microscope, you're the scientific instrument. Your observations are how other people are going to learn about this community, even if the other people are people from the community that are trying to figure out how to draw in tourists, right? You're going to be sharing the lives of people you've interviewed, tourists you've interviewed. It's all getting filtered through your brain space, right? So know your own background and personality type and how you feel about the topic you're studying. We all have a background. We're almost never purely neutral on a topic that we're studying, unless you're studying like, I don't know, Slinkies or Jello or something. You probably have opinions and thoughts, and some people even have opinions about Jello. So be aware of your background. If you're studying a pilgrimage site, maybe what are your views about spiritual activity? If you're studying a natural site, what are your views about environmental protection? If you're studying a historic site, how do you view this whole thing of people not from a community coming in and consuming history? What is your background? What are your feelings? How does that affect your work? Even if you're studying your own community, you are weird. And what I mean by that is you're probably different in some ways than your host community, because anthropologists by their nature are kind of oddballs. So make sure you kind of understand your own subjectivity, as the reading put it. Doesn't mean to then not do good work. You can, sometimes your background is not an obstacle. It's not a bias. It's a gateway. It's something that people will learn about your background and be like, oh, that's cool. I want to share with you. Maybe you've always been a hiker. And so when you go and do research with hikers, as was the case with Lukens, you get really good data because you can really know how to talk to hikers. So, but just know what your positionality has and the strengths and also possible hindrances that brings. And then finally, be familiar with culture shock. Okay. Basically the idea of culture shock was actually developed by an anthropologist that worked with Tlingit people, of all people. So there's both an anthropology connection here and an Alaska connection. He wrote a famous paper about this, but it's something that a lot of people that are in the tourism industry, as well as in the anthropology line of work, bring up, which is the idea that when we move to a place that's culturally different, we go through some fairly predictable, not fully predictable, but somewhat predictable stages. We sometimes talk about the honeymoon period where everything seems magical and wonderful. Then we go through a culture shock period where everything starts to feel very off-putting because it's not what we're used to, and then eventually kind of an adjustment, and where you probably change some of your own ways as well as some of your own expectations, start to be a little more honest about what the goods and the bads, the new community that you find yourself in. And often it's there where you start to do some of your best research. Although I actually think culture shock is a good place to do research. It's often when you're like most stressed out about like, holy crap, this is weird, that you start to see things that are things about the culture that's very different and therefore worth writing down. But anyways, be aware of that when you go into the field, that there will be a little bit of culture shock and that it is perfectly normal and that it is not the first time it's happened. It happens for most people when they move to a new place. And then final point is exiting the field like not an idiot. So we sometimes talk about exiting the field, but I hate that terminology because you don't really exit humans, right? Like hope some of these people have probably made huge impacts on you, and you may be friends with them the rest of your life. I have people from Navajo Reservation that I consider adopted family at this point, and we use kinship terminology with each other. But there will be a lot of other people, I would say about 90% of those people, who you don't see again, or maybe you do see occasionally, but maybe not, especially if you're doing really rapid ethnography, like for a land agency. You may never see folks in that community again. Think about how you're going to conclude your research. One of that is just making sure that when you leave, you're honest to what they said to you, that you protect people's confidences when there's things they didn't want you to say, and that you really do a good job presenting their viewpoints. You have something sacred in your hands when you're representing someone else's viewpoints and their culture. It helps to write as you go along, to see where you're at with your findings, and it helps when you get home to do really good data analysis, which I don't have time to explain, but could explain another time if you're curious. And also just identify what more needs to be done, because sometimes the first thing an employer is going to ask you, or a grant agency or a tribal agency, is, okay, good project. We have a little bit of extra money. What do you want to look at now? And so be ready to answer, here's the next 3 things that I would like to look at if I had time to look more into your tourism issue. So that is a little bit about designing a research project. Now, in conclusion, we've covered so much ground in this lecture, and it ended up being rather longer than I intended it to be. I'll try to make next week's not nearly so long, but I wanted to make a couple of concluding points. Number 1, travel has always been a huge part of anthropology. Number 2, anthropology has some incredible things it can tell us about travel, as your one reading was suggesting, because we can go and really get to know people, the people behind tourism and traveling. And number 3, when we do field work of any sort, whether it's about tourism or about any other topic, we ourselves are being travelers. So be aware of things like culture shock, be aware of things like your own background, be thoughtful about how you enter community, be a good community member, whether you're traveling for research or for any other reason. So that's a little bit of my spiel today. Thank you.